Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast. Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching. I'm Katie.
And I'm Elena.
And Elena, we've got a big topic today. I'm a little nervous. I'm pretty excited. I think it's an important one, but yeah, very big topic.
Oh, yes. We always get a little bit fearful when we have these really complex topics to talk through, but I agree that this is a really important one. It's resonated a lot with people in the past. I think it's been coming up for us and for our athletes again. And yeah, we just want to dive in and see what we can discover from it.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about body image in endurance sports. But before we do that, we're going to jump into some exciting coaching and training insights as we always do. So, Elena, do you mind if I kick it off?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so my first insight today, I just have some high-level thoughts on a really common reaction that I see in a lot of my athletes, which is the idea of having shame around missing workouts or not actually nailing your workouts perfectly, where athletes will comment like, oh, like I missed 3 days in a row. I'm so sorry. I'm your most difficult athlete, all this different stuff. And as a coach, that really breaks my heart just because at the end of the day, we are all recreational athletes. And for me as a coach, my job is to support you as a human, not to make sure that you're nailing everything perfectly all the time. But I do think that shame reaction is really, really common. It's something that many people in this space can be a little bit kind of pleasers. They want to work with the coach and they appreciate that the coach has put in stuff for them to do. But I just try really, really hard to shut that down as a coach to say like, hey, if you're not hitting workouts, that's not a you issue. That's a life thing, or it's something about the balance of the workouts, or it's just something completely unrelated. And let's take it away from like you as an athlete and you as a person. It's sort of like we've talked about Brene Brown and practicing shame resilience, but actually reality checking that situation and knowing that it's not you, it's something else, and that your coach is a partner in helping you figure out how to best approach it if you're not hitting those workouts, but it's never a you issue and you should never apologize to your coach. Just communicate what you're going through, and I think that can help a lot.
Bringing back Brene Brown. She's back already.
I know, yeah. I feel like we can't make it through. It's been a couple podcasts and we haven't talked about her, so we always have to.
Yeah.
But yeah, PSA to everybody, just don't let shame come into your missed workouts.
Agree. Love it.
And then my second insight here is I wanted to think about gels and taking gels. We've talked about how it's useful to take a gel even during short workouts sometimes. But I think a reason to do that beyond just, the hit that you get, the energy that you get from taking the gel, is that it's really important to practice taking in gels when you're going at a much higher intensity than you are during like something super easy. Because if you think about, let's say you normally go out for your long runs and you have some time on and some time off. And during the off intervals, that's when you always take your gel. Well, at race pace, you're going to be on the entire time. And so I don't want people to get it in their head that they only know how to either logistically take a gel when they're going easy or just kind of process it from a GI perspective. So once people are really, really comfortable with fueling during their runs, I do suggest working on some of that timing piece and saying like, okay, take it during your on interval and know that you can do that. And maybe there's a little bit of fumbling around and figuring out what feels smooth or not, but just getting into that habit sooner rather than later so you can do it, I think can be really, really helpful on race day.
I absolutely agree with this. It's like both practical and then also, as we talked about before, from the fueling and recovery perspective, it can never hurt you. So not only getting in the habit of it, but being okay with mentally just like taking the gels, knowing you have to fuel these runs, and your body will thank you for that, I think, down the road.
Totally. And the only thing I could envision with it like hurting you would be if you had a really bad GI reaction, which has happened to some athletes before taking a gel. Let's say you take like some of the ones that aren't that isotonic. If you don't take them with water, it can lead to some level of GI distress. But that's something you want to figure out now as you're practicing, not during the race. So kind of sorting through like, hey, maybe this is an issue with this specific type of gel. And then saying like, okay, I can try something else, I think is pretty helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's all about experimentation.
Totally. And then my last insight here is I've got some thoughts on blood work and labs and supplementation. And anyone who's been listening to Elena and I talk about supplementation knows that we talk about iron all the time. Well, I've got a new thing to add to the list of things to check, which is the idea of checking your vitamin D. So I actually recently found out that I was pretty deficient in vitamin D. And that makes a lot of sense because it is cold and my skin has not seen the sun in days and days and days. And I've actually heard that vitamin D is something that's really, really underdiagnosed in terms of deficiency for most people that live in a northern climate, just because you're not getting that exposure through sunlight. But it does have some pretty important performance effects. effects in the sense of immune system stuff, muscles, bones, all of that are very affected by vitamin D. So all this is to say, I'm getting on the vitamin D supplementation train, and I'm excited to see if that makes me feel awesome and enhances my performance in any way. I don't know that I've been feeling terrible recently, but sometimes it's hard to tell if you've been deficient in something for a little while. So this is just a call to the athletes. If you're feeling any type of fatigue or feeling off a little bit, consider getting your vitamin D checked. And it's probably low if you live somewhere in one of these climates until it gets a little bit warmer outside.
Yep, and, a reminder on that too is that I believe the what we would consider being a lower threshold for vitamin D would also not be marked as, like, being actually low on most US labs from an athlete perspective. So if you're on the lower end too, it's, like, good to be supplementing regardless. Again, it's one of those things that's, like, really hard for anyone to be too far over vitamin D, but be checked first before you do that, but I've been vitamin D supplementing for, I think, the last, like, 4 years, and I'm still kind of on the lower end of the spectrum, so it's important.
Awesome. All right, Elena, what is new in your coaching and training life?
Yes, okay, so I think 2 main things I wanna talk about. One on the kind of like you coming on the first coaching point of how athletes are reacting. I have a few athletes that are kind of getting back into a full training load coming out of winter, and so just have a few things to remember as you're kind of getting back into a training season. One thing that I do think is really important is focusing on heart rate instead of pace. I find that there's typically a lot of anchoring on past paces, especially from previous seasons, and frustration that the athlete isn't there right away, which is totally expected. And so focusing on heart rate, especially getting back into it before transitioning that focus to pace, I think is incredibly important at these early season runs, easy running, getting back in there, etc. And along with that, please, please, please to my athletes and to everyone, drop the judgment associated with it. And know it's so much easier said than done. I have been here too. It's really hard not to judge where you are now versus where you have been. For some reason, I think comparing to yourself is even that much trickier than comparing to others, especially if you've already been there. But just trust the process. Know that after, a month, a few weeks of getting into this training process again, you will start seeing those improvements. You'll get back to where you have been previously, but it takes time, it takes commitment, and the early part of the process is really challenging because it's unfamiliar. You have all this mental judgment, etc. So just be okay with it. Embrace the fact that it'll be a little uncomfortable for a few weeks. Focus on your heart rate, and then trust that you'll get to where you want to get to.
Yeah, I love this insight, and I see this with athletes all the time and with myself, especially at the beginning of the season. Something I sort of recommend on this vein is if the data is getting in your head, use less data. Like just go by heart rate, even only keeping up that heart rate screen on your watch so you can really kind of ground in the intention of the workout. I think is helpful, but want to validate that's really tough to do. Like it uploads and you still see it, and there's still some of the judgment attached. But I think another reframe too is if you did your off season right, you should definitely not be at your peak pace coming into a new season, right? Like you should allow that fitness to come down so that you can build higher. So I often tell athletes who see numbers that don't look as great as their peak last season, I'm like, great, this is exactly where we want you to be, because if you had stayed exactly where you were, there's nowhere higher to go. You need to come down in order to kind of ride that wave over time and then cumulatively build fitness.
Yeah, I think that's a really great reframe, and I've thought about that too, right? It's like we want you to be there so that you can have the space to grow into it and have your healthy body get there, as opposed to always being at this peak level, which often will not be sustainable over time. So, definitely, that was one big thing that I wanna talk about. The other one is that I'm surprised I didn't put this as foreshadowing as my gear pick of the week, as another bougie gear pick of the week, but I got a treadmill a couple of weeks ago now. Pretty basic one. I got it from Costco before their January sale was done, but I've been really thinking about it for a long time, and I have been really loving it. And there's a few things that I want to talk about because I had become interested in it from seeing how athletes, my peers, and also other coaches had been thinking about doing some work on treadmills. And I was like, you know what? I kind of want to have this as an option for myself. And I think there's a few reasons why it's really helpful. Even though I historically have not been much of a treadmill girly, I do think that there's some places where it's really helpful. One is for speed work. As I've been getting back into speed, there are times where I obviously will go outside. I've always done it outside, but there are also times where mentally I feel like I need to have that, like, very just certain push of, like, knowing what pace I'm at and just being able to get my body moving in that way. It doesn't have to be for all that long, but it gives me the ability to just run at a certain pace and have my body feel that, which for me, I think has both physical effects of, like, biomechanically getting that feel again, and also mental effects of having the confidence of running at those paces. That's been really helpful from using a treadmill perspective. And then in addition to that, I think that the main thing I've been using it for is just consistent uphill work when I can, no excuses, just go out and go on a treadmill for a mile or two, getting consistent uphill treadmill work, which I think builds speed. I can do it in my zone too, so it's just more aerobic base. I'm not trying to crush any workouts on it. I'm just like trying to get another stimulus. And for me, that is super easy to do as opposed to like going back out to a trail or going out on the road. It's just something I can do very quickly. I don't have to think too much about it. For that reason, I feel like treadmills can be a really nice tool. I don't think that you have to have a treadmill. I don't think it's like the biggest thing ever for your training, but thinking about it as a tool for when you're feeling like, hey, I need a little bit of speed confidence, I need a little bit of speed stimulus, or I just want to do something a little different today. Maybe I'm just going to like go hike on an uphill treadmill or go do a steady uphill treadmill run, which I think can really build a lot of power, strength, etc., and get you used to like when you go out and run a flat road, then you're just feeling like you're a tank. So just putting it out there as a potential tool to use, especially in the winter.
This is interesting. So I am not a treadmill girly at all. Like I don't think I could run more than 3 or 4 miles on a treadmill ever. So I do have some questions for you if you'll indulge me. Do you find it a lot harder? Like I don't know if it's mentally or physically for me, but running at my easy pace on a treadmill for me often does feel harder than running on that same pace outside. So I don't know if that's just a me thing.
Yeah, okay, super interesting. I have yet to do an easy run on the treadmill as if I'm doing it for a longer stimulus. And mainly because historically I've felt very similar to you. I don't really love doing that. If I'm going to do an easy run on the treadmill, I'm going to make it a lot easier of a pace, which is also fine if I'm just trying to get an easy run. And so I'm fine doing it at like a, what I would do is less pace than I'm outside. However, for the speed work and for the uphill work, that's what I've been using it for, and it feels much more effective than what I had been doing outside sometimes. For uphill, definitely, because I can just like I can run trail for sure, but it's really snowy right now and it varies a lot. And just being able to like mind off 15 minutes consistent. There's no road hills around here that I'm going to run consistently for 15 minutes or more uphill. And then similarly for speed, I'm still doing workouts outside and that's really nice. But like when I'm running a speed interval, I don't really know what my pace really is from my watch perspective. And I'm not saying you have to have that fully, like I go by feel a lot, but getting my body used to that turnover has been really, really helpful. I think in just like getting back to more of a, I think honestly, like mental confidence just as much as the physical effect. So yeah.
I mean, you are as mentally confident as they come if you can do speed workouts on the treadmill. I'm just so impressed when my athletes do that too. And some of my athletes do that for all their workouts, which I think is so cool. But maybe I'll have to try this out with like a baby workout if I do try it out. Instead, I am muscling through this Boston winter and it's been absolutely brutal and I run in every single condition possible. But sometimes it's not ideal for the speed that I'm looking for.
No, I totally get it. And I'm like you. I mean, I've people ask me about running in the cold all the time. I'm like, I've always run in the cold. It's never not been like I've run in snow, I've run in blizzards, wind is tricky, but I've run in it. Like I run in anything. But yeah, it's just been a little bit maybe it's just like a pleasant surprise that I wasn't expecting this from the treadmill work. And then I guess to your point on like it feels harder. It actually ironically is supposed to be a little easier, which means it's that much more mentally challenging when we're running an easy pace. So technically, especially for like speed work, I'm usually setting it at like 1 to 2% incline to try to like even out the paces. And again, I'm not trying to like perfect my paces. It's not like I'm trying to prove anything, but generally they say that it's a little bit of an assist when you're running faster on a treadmill. So yeah, it's kind of funny, the mental versus physical balance of using a treadmill versus being outside.
Yeah, totally. And I think just one more question on that before we jump into our main content is I have heard sometimes even from an injury prevention perspective, it's good to set your treadmill at like a 1 to 2% incline for even just easy runs. Do you subscribe to that for that reason, or is it more just kind of like trying to even out the speed?
I do from speed perspective, it's for evening out the speed because I would have the same, I think, like injury impact if I'm running flat ground outside. If anything, a treadmill's give a little bit of give, so it's maybe a little bit better from that. But definitely for like part of the reason why I'm using it as a running stimulus is because on the uphill perspective, it's really low impact additional work. So I can treat it as like I'm not getting the same impact if I'm going out and doing a 2 mile run outside if I'm doing a 2 mile uphill treadmill. And so that I really ascribe by. And in that case, my uphill is anywhere from, I mean, I do 3% if I'm going easy for a little bit, like totally easy. But when I'm doing like focused uphill work, then I'm like up in the 10 to 12% grade area. So
Interesting. Wow. Well, I'm intrigued. I might play with this. I might not, but I like the perspective. And this is maybe the first time we've talked about the treadmill on the podcast. So super good to do. Okay, so I think with that, let's jump into our main content today. And as we were kind of putting together this outline, I think we just thought a lot of people have reacted to it when we've sort of alluded to themes related to body image on the podcast before. And so there seems to be some big demand for kind of drilling into the topic. But we also wanted to caveat this by saying that we don't have all the answers. And this is a really, really tough topic to get into at baseline. And everyone's experience is pretty different with respect to body image. But I think we're just going to talk about some themes that have resonated with us, that have resonated with our athletes, and maybe some frameworks for thinking about it, while acknowledging that there's not one right framework and it is kind of hard to get into. So that's our approach. Elena, do you have anything to add to our high level approach on that?
I don't think anything major to add. I like how you framed that. I think the other thing that I will say, because we were just talking about it, and as we were talking about how tricky of a topic this is, one of the reasons why we want to tackle it is because it seems like there's this world of like can really easily spot toxic body image on Instagram, or when people talk about it, we're like, oh no, we don't want you to think like that. That sounds like you've been more prescribed to like a really toxic space of how you think that you have to be a certain way. However, there's the other side of this, which is like, everything's fine, you're awesome, love yourself all the time, which is nice in theory, but it doesn't always correspond to like actually how people are experiencing this world as an endurance athlete and how people think about themselves. So we're trying to occupy a space more in the middle of the spectrum of like how we think about body image and how we've seen this impact people in the endurance community.
Totally. All right. So with that, I think let's just jump into some of these themes and we can riff a little bit. A first one that we wrote down is the challenges of thinking about bodies changing over time. And I think this is relevant in a couple different domains. One of them is like injury periods. If you're injured, it is possible that your body composition is going to change in a way that really affects you kind of more mentally because you're not training the way you were before. Similarly, recovery periods, off seasons. We've talked in the past about how there is sort of a natural ebb and flow of body comp, and I think that can impact body image considerations a lot. And then if we focus specifically on the female athlete population, I see this in thinking about like puberty transition, pregnancy transition, and then perimenopause, menopause transition. That can be a really, really challenging time for especially female athletes in particular, with respect to just radical changes in how your body actually looks, which then can have pretty cascading effects on your perception of your own body. So yeah, just want to call those out as spaces where we see a lot of this being a big struggle in our athletes. And I've certainly experienced that too, kind of the overtime changes and not really knowing what to do with that because it can shake, your understanding of yourself, how you see yourself as an athlete, even if in an ideal world we would want to decouple those things.
Yeah, definitely. And that made me think, Katie, like I'm curious how do you feel like your body has changed? Like when do you feel like those main pivot points were for you? And do you still think that's something that is affecting you to this day? Or is this like it might again when you go through pregnancy, but like right now I feel really stable. I'm just kind of curious how you weigh that change.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think we talked about it a little bit way back when we did our female athlete series almost a year ago. I think for me, a pretty radical transition that I wasn't fully aware of was just moving in from being like a skinny high schooler into like having an adult female body, which is going to carry fat in different ways and is going to carry muscle in different ways. And I think that's a radical shift that, we've talked about. Lauren Fleshman's Good for a Girl, books like that really talk about this really, really fundamental change in body comp that women go through. So I think that was hard for me in different ways. I've also talked about how I was not necessarily at a healthy point with respect to body comp in kind of early in college. And I did have to really say, like, I need to have a regular menstrual cycle. I need to make sure that I'm taking in enough calories for the activity that I'm doing. And as a result, my body needs to change to be able to support the activities that I wanted to do. So I think that was a little hard for me at the time as well. And we've talked about also how, sometimes through that process, when there's bodies changing, there can be a really toxic world out there of unsolicited comments about bodies in general. And I certainly experienced that a lot. And I think for me, even though I feel pretty solid in where I'm at right now, the shadow of those types of comments follows me pretty much wherever I go. And I do find I'm a little bit more sensitive when people say things that might actually be really, really well intentioned, but are not that. And we'll get to this later. But my advice as a coach, as a friend, as a person is you should not be making comments about someone's body ever. Like, just don't do that. You can praise other things. You can say positive things about a lot of other elements of who a person is. But for me in general, I really, really don't like when there are comments about my body, even if they are more positive versus negative, because I think that can maybe trigger that shadow a little bit more that I experienced kind of earlier on in life.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And yeah, to reemphasize, I think those previous episodes, we go a little bit deeper on maybe the puberty point specifically of Good for a Girl, and I think I had similar experiences with that. I had a little bit of a different perspective because from the hockey world, I was always being told I wasn't big enough, and then that flipped really suddenly when I was trying to get into running and trying to get into the endurance world, and I was, like, caught between 2 worlds, and it was me maybe realizing just how much these other external expectations were influencing everything, right? You go to one community and there's certain expectations, you go to another community and there's other expectations, and you, like, look at the world in terms of, like, beauty standards and what's being, like, funneled down your throat all the time, and there's another set of expectations. So, recognizing that where those influences are coming from and then regrounding in yourself, I think was a critical learning that I had to take on, and yet I think we still both experienced, like you mentioned, the shadows of all of that, and it's never, like, fully past you.
Totally, and I think this actually jumps ahead to another point we have, but I think if you look at these different stages in life or, the pressures, for example, in a hockey world relative to an endurance world, I think we can almost always find something to be very critical about. Or if you go into kind of maybe conventional American standards of beauty, for example, you just go through all these different worlds and there always is an expectation on people to look a certain way. And I think for me, I can even reflect on times when, I've probably been a lot closer to the edge of being a little bit too lean. And there I'm like, okay, well, I feel critical of this. Like maybe I don't look healthy or something, but then I feel like I'm carrying more weight and I'm like, oh, I feel like, I'm not lean enough for my sport or whatever that is. And for me, it's been important to catch that kind of at those completely different points and be like, hey, you're never totally happy with where you're at. You're always going to find something to be critical of. And so instead of kind of chasing that perfection, focusing on the things that really do matter with respect to like, hey, how am I actually performing and how do I feel? I think that's been helpful for me. But just pointing out that I don't know that I've ever been like, oh no, this is exactly perfect. Like this is exactly where I want to be, kind of no matter what.
Yeah, yeah, totally, and I think that's an important thing that we will, I think, keep coming back to, which is regrounding in how you feel and how you're performing, as opposed to how you think you're critiquing how things look, and specifically, I think the very clear metric of the scale. And it might be a nice to transition to talk a little bit about how weight influences into this, because this is something that I feel like I was experiencing relatively recently, actually, of like, okay, I'm having another phase of body change, and why is it that I can feel better, but as soon as I know what my weight on the scale is, it gives me a bit of a sinking feeling, even though I know that that shouldn't I am really well grounded in how I feel and how I feel strong, but this is still affecting me, and reminding myself of how that metric doesn't necessarily translate at all to my performance. You don't even know where it's coming from. I mean, it could be like I could be stronger, my tendons are stronger because 'cause they're healing, or my muscles are getting stronger in certain ways, and it could be fat, it could be not, but, like, I feel better, and yet my weight was still something that was on my mind, and I think that's something that I see so, so often with people, is even if, like, you're not feeling like you have to chase being lighter on the scale, if you start gaining on the scale, then people start feeling like, "Oh, that's not a good thing," even though that could be a sign of healthy change, and it also could be a sign of just, like, your body changing in general, and it should be kind of ignored, honestly, if you're feeling okay. But, yeah, I don't know, Katie, how do you think about weight when it comes into this?
Yeah, no, it's super tough. I mean, I even think of the example where, like, over a female menstrual cycle, it is super common to weigh more sort of right before and around your period. And yet, every single time that I'm there, I'm like, is something going on? Like, what's going on here? Like, I feel like I'm carrying a little bit more weight. And if I were to like hop on a scale and notice that it was a little bit different, I think there would be some negative feeling around it, for example. Whereas I know that that's not really going to change how I perform in that moment. It's all just kind of these normal fluctuations. But it leads to this question of like, do we even think tracking weight is something that's useful? And obviously, sometimes you can't get around it. Like you show up at the doctor and it's like, all right, I have to do this thing. But I think at the end of the day, how I've seen it manifest in most athletes is that it creates more problems than it solves. So usually I'm not really recommending, like, I see it as like a yellow to reddish flag if someone's like, oh, I weigh myself all the time, just because it shows that there's this really, really big fixation on what that is. But, sometimes too, you could think about it as wanting to monitor, for example, not just dropping off, losing a ton of weight. I would say as a coach, I can usually just tell, or as a person, I can tell if that's where I'm at to begin with or where one of my athletes is at just from like kind of how we're interacting. But yeah, do you have thoughts on like on net? Is this even a useful tool or should we just totally abandon it entirely?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question. I find that I fall into a similar camp as what you were describing, that I think it creates more problems than it helps. So I'm kind of anti having weight as a tool. The one area that where I could see myself being cautiously supportive is if an athlete is going and getting like a bod pod test. It's a little bit more comprehensive of like your body composition entirely and not just your weight with more of an understanding of like where you are. I actually did that last year mainly because I was like, I want to go understand where I'm at, and I got like a metabolic test to basically to make sure that I was fueling enough for my like energy availability calculations. I was like, okay, cool. Like that was really informative because I know exactly like what my lean mass is, which is what feeds into the calculation that I need to do for like the amount of calories I need to sustain for each kilogram of lean mass. I'm not checking that again. I haven't checked it since. And if I go check it again, I have to prepare myself because I would worry that I would feel negatively if something changed in what my mind viewed as negatively, but I would still see it as a useful tool for like calculating my fueling needs. From a weight perspective, I think it's like pretty unhelpful. Like I said, my weight has changed. It's actually gone up more significantly than it has in a really long time. And I feel much stronger than I've been in a long time. And so maybe we could reframe it as like, why are we not like celebrating? Oh, like what was a cool thing? Oh, my weight went up 5 pounds. That's great. I'm stronger. Like, I don't think no one ever has that reaction in their brain. I certainly don't. But for some reason, we're very accustomed to the reaction of like, oh, I lost 5 pounds. That's awesome. Like, way to go. And so, really, just like when it's such an ingrained societal thing, I don't see it adding a lot of value, especially when it doesn't tell you much about how you feel and how you're performing, which how you feel and how you're performing will tell you that. So,
Yeah, I mean, maybe to your point there, there's just like the reason this is so tricky. One of the reasons is because there's a lot of cognitive dissonance when you're actually performing better and you feel better and everything seems good. But then there's this number that, for whatever reason, has a really, really negative valence in your head, or a trend that has a negative valence. And so I like your idea of like, okay, is there a way to actually positively reframe this? Is like, hey, the first point is I am performing better. And the second point is like, oh, here's a number that actually corroborates that because it says that I'm fueling super well and I have the energy for what I need to do. But I think society has made it such that that's really, really hard to internalize. So I don't really know what the answer is, but I like the intention to say like, hey, this could actually be a good thing, even though it's not necessarily accepted as a good thing. And I think we do get messaging all the time from other people, from social media, from whatever it is, that continues to pound in the point that it's not a good thing.
totally, yeah, and I think whenever there's such a strong norm like that, I find it helpful to imagine where the norm is, like, flipped on its head like that, and there's really no reason that that wouldn't be the case. It just hasn't been what we've been conditioned to do over a lifetime, right? So, yeah, I could see it as a world where we're, like, really psyched about gaining weight from the strength perspective, and to be fair, there probably are communities that are like that, right? Like, bodybuilding, I think you could imagine people are really excited about gaining weight from a strength perspective, although there's a whole lot of other things with leanness that I'm sure is a little bit more toxic in that space. But yeah, just to throw it out there, maybe you can, if you're feeling that ever hopping on a scale for whatever reason at the doctor's office, or hopefully avoiding scales in general, but feeling strong, just try to practice reframing the power in your strength. And if that's more weight on the scale, that's totally fine.
Mhm. And the final point there too is that scales can be pretty misleading with respect to this point on body comp in general. There's muscle and there's fat. You know, you could be just building a lot of muscle and that's just changing the number in a way that's not really reflecting what's going on. It's also okay if you're gaining fat because that is a hormonal reserve that's going to help you just be healthier as a whole, and I do think can be helpful for performance. So there's just not as much nuance probably as this topic needs reflected in like a cheap scale that you got at Walmart for $12. You're like,
Yes.
and it's like, why is this creating such a like complex in my head? But related to kind of those ideas in our head, I'm curious to riff a little bit on the idea of, I think a lot of people think of a body's appearance, so body image, as a reflection of like sort of athlete status. Like, okay, I look like a runner, I look like an elite athlete or not. And I think that's really, really pervasive, probably due in part to what we see on social media, what the algorithm shows us. But I think it's important to divorce those two things and think about like, hey, your body's kind of just a vessel for what you're doing, but it's not a reflection of your status as an athlete or your status as a person or your worth. That's something that I just see kind of more commonly than we would think. And people probably don't put it in those terms, but I think it's kind of an internalized idea that I probably feel the shadow of sometimes too, where I'm like, well, I want to look like an athlete, when at the end of the day, there's so many different ways to look like an athlete or just to be an athlete that aren't as related to this overall look.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that I have always thought about when it comes to this is very much typically defined by the sport that you are going to. So, for example, if you're going to an Ironman competition and you see everyone walking around, and you might have more associations with a certain body type from that perspective than I did when I was at hockey tournaments seeing all the girls, or at basketball tournaments seeing all the collegiate athletes. And I think it's just a reminder that athletes come in all shapes and sizes with bodies doing different things. And where I have found a little bit of solace in this is, one, I mean, just being really aware of it, talking about it. Like, we are really aware that these are ideas that are developing in our heads. And then two, seeing honestly, at least in the world of trail running, I just see like such a broad example of different types of bodies. And that is really grounding to me. And maybe that's not always the case in other sports. Like there are some sports where, like basketball, where everyone's 6+ or whatever, 6'5", and you see a 6'1" athlete and you're like, wow, they look short. And they're like 6'1" or 6'2". But then you still see sometimes like the really scrappy 5'10" point guard who's crushing it out there, right? So there's like always examples of counters in these spaces, but regardless, in the trail running world, I do think there's a real range of athletes because some people are coming from, maybe more of like a intense road running background. Some people are coming from the mountain background and have a lot more strength in that. And there's just a big range. So yes, I very much have felt this before. I think the strongest I ever felt this was in the college setting as well, Katie. I think that was just when all of these ideas were kind of shoved down our throats. But since then, I think I try to recognize it and then try to seek out the counter examples to what I think my mental rule is, and still be reminded that that performance is like something that I'm really aspiring to, that I'm really inspired by. So it's tricky, but I totally get this concern. How does it feel from like, I guess the Ironman perspective? I'm a little less familiar with that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think like if we think of Kona, for example, Kona actually has an event called the Underwear Run, where a couple days before the race, everyone goes out. I actually haven't done this before, I think due to travel or whenever I was arriving, but it's like 4 days before the race, people show up and they run this like mile race or 5K just totally in their underwear. And it's this just display of everyone's like all oiled down and toned up. And it's this big focus on like, this is what some people's bodies look like in the space. And yet there are lots of other bodies out there. I think that's maybe not the best example, but it is an example of like there is this focus on everybody's looking at everyone else's bodies. And I will say, I mean, something that I hear from athletes all the time is that body image stuff can be really, really activating at races because you're surrounded by kind of other people that do the sport that you do. And I think there probably is a tendency to pick out like, oh, that body looks really athletic or that body looks really, really lean, and not actually kind of looking at the holistic population of people that are there. But at least in the triathlon space, like you need a body that is powerful and that can bike and that can swim and do all these things that require a ton of power. And you need the reserves to be able to go all day long. So I've tried to kind of keep that in mind, and that a triathlete body is a strong body. And there's so many different ways that that can manifest, but it's not the type of body that a gust of wind comes along the Queen K and your bike topples over. Like that is not the body that you want to get through these big races.
That's so funny that there's an underwear race. I have truly never heard of that or imagined that, but it honestly kind of makes sense from what I would imagine from the community too, of like, this is just like a funny thing, but we all look really lean or whatever. Yeah, it's really that's interesting too, because as you were saying that, I think there was something that triggered in my mind of like how it's more activating at race settings, and how I can imagine those race settings where I've had that feeling before too, when you're kind of like a little bit nervous on the start line and the insecurities are creeping in, and you're looking around at other athletes and seeing like, oh, well, they look like they're really good and they look like they're really good. And how would I compete with that? And then it just reminded me like, no, I want to reground in my own mental preparation, in my confidence, and in my like, honestly, like killer attitude. Maybe this is an opportunity to like practice your killer attitude of like, I'm going to crush these people. And even if you even I mean, sure, some of them might beat you, but like even if you're manifesting that for yourself, I think that is just like a really powerful way to counteract it. And I have had races where I've really blown out of the water of people who, in my opinion, looked really intimidating to me. And it's not like I'm just like admitting that like I think we can talk about not trying to judge people's bodies as much as we want, but like naturally we're going to have some ideas that are just like subconsciously filtering through our brains when we're looking around and scanning our competition. And so I try to counteract that as much as I can. And if I find myself getting insecure, then like maybe it's like regrounding in your kind of like, yeah, your killer attitude of just like, I'm grounded in my own confidence. I'm not gonna let this insecurity get in my way. Let's go do this thing.
Yeah, no, I relate this so much. And this actually reminds me of my race at CETA Summit this year, where I talked. If anyone wants to go and listen to that long saga of that episode, you can. We'll link in the show notes. But I remember I was like not that confident. And then race week, I started to get really confident. And I was like, wait, I think I could actually win this race. And then I showed up at the packet pickup the day before. And, I feel like it was almost subconsciously that I was sort of just scanning the crowd and seeing a bunch of other women. In my head, I was like, they look really fast. Like, I think they're going to smash it. And I was kind of sizing them up based on how they looked. And then some of them finished back in the pack and some of them finished like in the top 10. And it was just this random thing that wasn't even really correlated to that. But I just caught myself doing it. And that's a good lesson of like, okay, bet on yourself, know what your preparation has done, know what your mind can do, and know what your body can do, the doing rather than the looking. But I think it happens sort of naturally, kind of no matter what, going into these spaces. And back to this point about dissonance, I think we still have an idea of what fast kind of looks like, and fast is not a look. It's fitness is a feeling, fast is a feeling, all that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the grounding point of all of this also is how we reground in our own confidence and build our own confidence and focus on the controllables, the internal sides of things instead of the external sides of things, which is a lesson and a practice for life no matter what you're thinking about, but how it relates to body image, I think is just this tendency of the external to be a louder, elevated voice in our heads than the internal, and a constant practice in having to reground ourselves in internal confidence in our feelings and curiosity with our body, what's our body telling us, as opposed to judgment of our body that we are being given from an external world. So that seems like a maybe a grounding point for how we just chatted about a lot of that at the race setting.
Totally.
On that point of the internal versus the external, I think it's maybe it could be important to kind of really deep dive on the external and what that looks like, even subtly, so that we can pick that out in our community members and ourselves and try to always counter that with a more internal focus. So, Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about what you hit on a little bit earlier of like these external body comments that you have seen in coaching a lot that I mean, we both have experienced, but how do you typically approach these external comments if they come up, or how do you recognize them when they're happening?
Yeah, so I think in general, this is really, really subtle. I think it's not as common anymore for people to say, like, hey, like, you look really fat. Like, that's not something that really comes out as commonly in this space. But I think the very sort of subtle and nuanced comments can actually have a very similar consequence. And I don't want to invalidate the idea that there are people who have actually experienced that type of really, really direct toxicity, but just talking about what we see as most common. So I think in general, any type of comment that starts with "you look dot dot dot" is probably not a good place to be. And what's tricky is sometimes those comments can be really, really well intentioned. And this actually recalls an example that Lauren Flashman gave in the book Good for a Girl, where she said there's this coded language of saying "you look healthy" means you look fat, and "you look fit" means you look lean. And that was something that really, really affected her kind of racing, where people would say, "oh, she looks healthy." And that was actually a super, super negative connotation, where if you weren't thinking about all of this, you'd probably be like, that sounds good. That sounds totally great. So, I mean, as a coach, I am never, ever making comments about how somebody looks. I always try to start with something like, hey, you are really strong or you are really fit. And what that means is your fitness is coming from your workouts. I've seen you do your workouts and you've absolutely been crushing it. But I think I've been very, very sensitive to those like "you look" comments, where even if someone tells me like, hey, you look really strong and healthy, in my head, I'm like, is that a negative thing? Like, is that actually a good thing? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Does it mean I'm not looking lean? Does it mean I'm like all of those things sort of start to spiral, even though I wish that they didn't. So I'm always just steering people away from that. And then something else I'll touch on too is I remember growing up, like I was just naturally sort of a skinnier kid, I would say. But I got a lot of comments about that when it was much, much before I was even thinking about controlling that in any way. That was the way that I was. But that has followed me, where people saying like, oh, like you're so slim when I was very, very young was something that I think led to a lot of resistance. When I like went through puberty and my body started to change, it was like, hey, I got validation for this thing and now I'm not going to get that anymore. So I think even if we think about like really young athletes and kids, you have to avoid making any of those comments at any point, because even if they're well intentioned, I think they can follow people in a pretty negative way.
Yeah, definitely, and it kinda reminds me of, like, I've experienced and I've heard more often, like, "Oh, well, they have the body for it. They have a runner's body or they have the cyclist body." And like we talked about before, there's some generic things that might be more common across different spaces, but it doesn't define the sport, and I think having those comments be shared implies that to the point of status as an athlete, you're giving someone higher status just by how they look for it. And I think that can really inform how we perceive, oh, I don't have that right now. So therefore I am not this. And that's kind of perpetuating it. So if you ever are hearing those kind of comments or even sharing those and how you think about the world, I think it can be helpful to challenge that a little bit and be like, what does that even mean? Do I need to perpetuate this? Because I think it can actually be more damaging than helpful.
Totally. So a couple more internal ones that maybe we could turn to and think about just like what is reinforcing this framework. Something that I've definitely experienced and that I hear from athletes is number one, when you feel like clothes are fitting differently in the context of body composition changes. I think this can be something that's really, really triggering for people. And I want to validate that those feelings are incredibly real. A reframe that I'd like to use is like, this is just clothes. This doesn't matter. In the grand scheme of who you are as a person and who you are as an athlete, it's not a big deal. But I think that's something that just comes out a lot because we can be very resistant to any type of change. And the clothes thing is something that is tough. I remember in our crowdsource contest, someone talking about like it is really tough as a female cyclist to find clothes that fit right. And if you can't find jeans that work for, your super, super strong quads and hamstrings and glutes, that can be triggering because it's not backing up to these standards of beauty that might exist on like the average woman. And that's quite challenging.
Definitely. I mean, I relate with that so hard. Like, I think we might all say that going shopping for jeans is one of the most stressful experiences.
Right?
So, I really don't enjoy it because I find it so hard to find things that fit, and I think feeling like I have to size up again, it's like the scale thing of like it's a number and like, oh, I have to size up and that must be like perceived as negative even though like it's really because I have a strong butt and then have to get things tailored to fit right. And so, yeah, I really relate with that, and I think maybe I could give a little bit more of a deeper perspective on how this was, like, coming up for me more recently because last year that yeah, I had, like, a longer period of stress-related things that prevented me from training the way I wanted to, but I think a large part of that was from a result of chronic undercarbing, which I just wasn't really aware of how it was impacting me until post 100 miler, which I fueled on Spring Energy and had fueled all my long runs on Spring Energy and then really not gelled on runs apart from that. And I was training a lot, had just kind of like come back to bite me. And my way of having to address this as I was working with a nutritionist was I was really committed to eating a lot and especially eating a lot of carbs. And I made probably the mistake of because I had a scale around, which ironically was I had the scale from when I had had a parasite earlier in the year and was concerned about how much weight I was losing, and recognized in the moment that as I weighed myself and was losing a lot of weight on the with the parasite, I had a sneaky positive feeling in my brain of like, "Oh my gosh, I'm losing weight." And I was like, "No, I don't want to reward this. Like I don't feel as good. I want to be stronger." And of course it came back on really quickly and I was feeling okay. But anyways, I had noticed that I was gaining about 10 pounds, which for me, this is the most my body has changed in quick succession since college. And it was more than I had known myself to weigh at any point. Yet I was starting to feel stronger and I was sleeping better and a lot of my symptoms were improving. And as I was doing this, yeah, some of my clothes didn't fit the same way. And when that happened, it was incredibly triggering because I was like thinking that I'm changing in a way that is away from what I wanna be as an athlete, and it was probably doubled by the fact that I was nowhere near training or competing on the level that I used to, and so it was, like, kind of an identity crash all at once, and I had to really think through that and be like, "Why is this bothering me so much? My body should be allowed to change, it should be allowed to heal," and to the point of what we talked about at the very beginning of the episode even, regrounding the sense that I don't need to be at, like, my race ready perspective from a body perspective right now. Like, I want to be in a place where I feel really good so I can train into being where I want to be. And this was all like I think really interesting to me to go through because I hadn't had to face it again so clearly since probably college because I just hadn't thought about my body had just stayed pretty stable and I was happy with that and I wasn't really going to like try to change anything drastically and this was just the first time where it changed in a way where I had to deal with what that felt like and it was probably really good information for me. I think it will make even though pregnancy I feel like could be hard at some point, it will make me feel probably more sympathetic and less judgmental with myself because I had to practice all of this. And then as I've started training and feeling really strong and feeling good again, I think I've gained another 5 pounds as I've been fueling. I'm not really sure. I don't know if I trust this 12-pound Walmart scale that I've now since thrown out because I was like, this is not helping me. But I think I gained maybe a little bit more weight and I feel, like I said, really strong. And that kind of brought all this back full circle to like, okay, I'm regrounding in my performance now. I am training. I am feeling good. And I have this massive change in my body. I shouldn't say massive. I don't even know how massive it is, but it's like a change in my body from where my baseline used to be. And I had to kind of go through all of this of the clothes don't feel right. And honestly, since the clothes have felt fine again. And I maybe it was just like a weird like you just don't really know what's going on with the scale. I don't think it's very helpful. And grounding again in how I feel has been probably the most important part of this.
Yeah, I love that you share this. And I think Often the change part is probably what's the hardest, right? Like once you just adjust this new normal, I think our bodies are actually really, really smart and start doing what they need to do in terms of performing and just being at sort of a stable place where they're happy and they're getting what they need. But when we're moving from a place where like maybe we weren't totally healthy, but we were a little bit lighter to a point where, yeah, like you're going to be a little bit heavier, but you're a lot healthier. I think that's like the hard transition piece. I'm curious. So for you, like it's come full circle now, you're feeling really good. How did you work on that from a mindset piece as you were kind of in it before you started to feel good while your training volume was still low? Because I think something that I see with some of my athletes is like they come in at a place where in order to be healthy, they need to gain weight. Like that's exactly what it is. They maybe are not getting regular menstrual cycle or they're just really fatigued, not feeling super well. And in that moment, it's hard to see the benefits of like, hey, if I were to, take down the training, up the calories, I'm going to start to feel a lot better. You don't see that right away. It takes a little bit of time. So how are you thinking about that in the moment and what type of mindset skills were you using to kind of like trust the process and just stick to it when it didn't feel so good at the time?
Yeah. Yeah, it was really tricky, and part of it, like, that question, it resonates with me from what we learned and what we talked to with Hannah Prunty a few weeks ago, how she had this clear goal of regaining her period so that she could start a family and was just committed to that and trusting the process with it. In my case, I think it was a little bit less clear of a goal because of how tricky all this stuff was. I never was entirely certain that it was because I was under fueling. It just made kind of intuitive sense to me. But like my BMI, and if you look, I mean, talk about looks. If you looked at me, I don't think you would be like, oh my gosh, she's underweight. So it was really unclear to me if there were other things going on that was not just related to fueling. And that was the hardest part, was like committing to the fueling plan without knowing for certain that this was going to turn out the way I wanted it to turn out. And so I guess in the moment, I was grounded by science, um, which was doing the low energy availability calculation, which is why I got the bod pod and did that calculation and realized how much I needed, and the fact that I was genuinely having some symptom improvement. Even if I wasn't feeling great from a running perspective, I could sleep through the night, which wasn't always consistent either. And sometimes it drove me crazy. I was like, my body is still waking up in the middle of the night, and I definitely have eaten plenty of food. So what's going on here? But I think just seeing a little bit of improvement and also giving it enough time, because also my volume was way down too. So there was a bit of a calibration of like both eating more and having less volume and trusting that after like a month I might feel some improvement. And I had enough like stop and go, like where I could train a little bit and feel the effects of like feeling a little bit better before I didn't feel as good again, and I had to like really recommit to that fueling to realize that it would just take this amount of time. It wasn't easy. Be really honest. I had many days where I was like really not trusting it, but even though I might have been really upset about it, I never stopped committing to fueling as much as the science had indicated that I should fuel, which was one metric goal that I could commit to amidst everything else feeling really chaotic. So maybe it was just that piece of like having to know how much I really needed and how hard that was for me. It was like a good challenge.
Yeah, and I like that in general, like being able to fixate on a goal can be helpful here. And if the goal is actually more process oriented here, it's like, hey, I'm trying to hit this amount of carbs or this amount of calories in a day because I know that that's what my body needs from a science perspective. I think that's helpful. And I mean, this reminds me of I've had athletes before who like just really don't want to fuel enough during their long runs. And they're like, well, I feel like it's enough if I have like, one gel for my 20-mile run or something. And I'm like, yeah, but feel is not fact. Like we can look at the facts and we can understand what you actually need in order to sustain kind of doing well, and knowing that that often falls way outside the realm of any type of like intuition in terms of what you think you need. And I think there's two sides to it. Number one is the intuition might be pulling you in the wrong direction with how much you actually need. And number two, society is pulling you in the wrong direction. And I think there's a lot of motivated reasoning at play here where if you hear anything that might indicate that being leaner would be better for your performance, you want to latch onto that and you want to hold on to it. And that's why there's so much doubt and lack of trust about this opposite narrative that's like, hey, if you feel yourself really, really well, you are going to perform better. And sometimes gaining weight is what you need in order to do that. I think it's just so much harder for that to click because of what's been pounded into people since the beginning of time in endurance sports. And while that narrative is changing a little bit, it's very, very slow and it certainly hasn't like flipped the script. And back to your point in the beginning, some version of that that new narrative is very much like, you are great no matter what. It's super, super positive, and it doesn't leave space for the fact that this is sometimes challenging. So I think there's just so much more nuance to the conversation than those two polls allow us to have. But I don't know, hopefully we can like push the narrative in the direction of validating that it's hard while still actually pushing the like you need to feel your body. And sometimes the idea of what you have in mind of what that might look like is not exactly in line with what's going to be best for your health and performance.
Yeah, and I think, like, to the point of the change that you had pointed out earlier, the challenging part might not even be, like, knowing scientifically that we should fuel as much as we are, but seeing your body change in the process and feeling like that is actually maybe a sign that you're not doing the right thing, when really you probably are from the fueling side. And to be honest, I'm quite optimistic. I do think this narrative is changing drastically recently. I know cycling has been the cycling sport has been fueling a lot, but I think from the running world, it's coming in triathlon. I think it's kind of always been the case, but it's been a really focus on fueling within events as opposed to like fueling holistically. And I think that narrative is being pushed a little bit more in addition to like the fueling at the highest level. I think is really focused on having everything dialed in for events, but maybe on the recreational level it just hasn't gotten pushed in the same way because it's so much intersection with the rest of body image culture. So to that point, I do think fueling is getting a lot more attention, and it's just tricky when people see it maybe changing their body. But I think you'll just feel, I mean, try it, and I think you'll just feel the impact of like finishing a long workout and not feeling entirely dead, maybe being able to go on with your day almost as normal and then feeling more recovered the next day. I just think the feel will speak for itself.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of like leads us into we could do a little wrap up section here with just these reframes that help us and help our athletes in thinking about body image. One of those is focusing on what your body can do and the feel, for example, of being really well fueled and crushing it. I think we've probably all had the experience before. And if you haven't, you should try it of like, hey, I crushed my fueling for like 2 days leading into a big workout. I crushed it during and I crushed it after. And I felt like I could do that big workout twice. It was not even a big deal at all. And that same workout would have killed me another time. And all of those metrics have absolutely nothing to do with how your body looks or doesn't look. It's just not even relevant to that. So maybe that's one thing we could challenge people to do is, hey, focus on the doing and the feelings rather than like this look or this perception of the look.
Definitely. I think another one we have is less time just focused on social media if it's not serving you, or looking up specific photos with the intention if you're catching yourself trying to focus on how people look, just like catch that and try to cut that influence out of your life. If you're spending a lot of time in front of your mirror, kind of resonating on things that you don't love about yourself, I think that's another sign of like, hey, we're not trying to focus on perfection here. I've actually found it helpful to sometimes reground in mirrors of being like, wow, I look strong in this way or this way. And maybe again, flip the script on its head of like, okay, if I was doing this not to be critical, but to be complimentary, here's what I would say. I think that's a really helpful practice too.
And related to that, knowing that a lot of things with like photos and mirrors comes down to silly things like lighting or whatever. Like it's such a silly thing to really get worked up about. Like, if you get a photo during a race and you're like, hey, I won that race and I do not look how I want to look in that photo because I was on a down step in my run. Like that's a silly thing. You know that you won the race or you had a really good time. And yet we all
Running
like
photos ever look good? They never look good.
yeah, you look at them and you're like, oh God, that's really bad. But again, look at the results and look at how you felt. And yeah, don't spend the $400 on the photo package if it's not
Yeah.
uplifting you.
Yep.
Another one to think about here is really tracking kind of performance and recovery metrics instead of weight related metrics. So saying like, okay, how are my paces going and how's my sleep, all of that. I think what's really interesting, like if you're having a tough body image day, to then like go out and smash a workout and say like, hey, I had those stats on a day that felt really tough, where I felt like my body was not the body that I wanted or I didn't like how it looked, and look what I could do even on that day. I think you'll often find that your perception of how your body looks and how you can perform are very, very divorced unless you let it get in your head and tell yourself that you can't succeed as a result of how your body's looking. So I just say like there's so many different stats that can factor into performance, and something like weight is very, very low on that list. So focus instead on the ones that really display kind of your true fitness, which is not, again, not a look, it's a feeling.
Definitely, and then I think related to that, those might be, like, the specific metrics, but then from a qualitative side, when we talk about feel, we talked about focusing on what your body can do, but also I think it's really helpful to try to be curious and notice the feelings that your body has when it feels good, and, like, take stock of those. And I think one for me, how I've noticed is like a feeling of flow when I'm on the run or on the bike. Like I feel like I have like a continued flow, or when I'm on a climb and feeling like, oh, I'm actually really strong on this climb. If I'm doing like a hilly run and just can feel like really be present in that moment when I'm coming up a climb and be like, wow, that my body feels really good on this. How I feel after runs, I think is a sign too of like how I feel when I'm finishing. If I feel like I can continue with my day, okay, I have brain power for the rest of the day, etc. I think just noticing and being curious about what your body feels like when things are good will help you kind of recognize and resonate in those if your body is changing or if you're having a insecure day from a body image perspective.
Totally. And then the last one that we have here is just this broader point on trusting the process and knowing that like your body will do what it needs to do as long as you're fueling it well. I like to think about the body as something that's actually very, very smart and that it's important to work with your body and not against your body. Elena, this gets back to my big like body mindsets project that I'm working on from a research perspective, which we will deep dive on another time. But again, thinking of our bodies as our friends and as really, really smart vessels that can kind of carry us to our goals if we're providing it with the resources that they need. I think this works against kind of the fear that we talked about maybe 2 episodes ago of like, okay, well, if I start fueling enough, is just going to be like this out of control spiral that I can't really have a handle on or something like that. No, the body's smart. It's going to work with you and it's going to do what it needs to do to support you. You just have to treat it really, really well. And saying that it looks really bad is not as much in line with treating it well as I think is ideal for performance.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I also think on the body being smart perspective that if you are fueling your body well and you're hitting your training, I think your body will do what it needs to do to adapt to that, to your point. So just let it do its thing. And then it takes off so much pressure of trying to like optimize everything else. Like think of all the things you can do if you're not worried about trying to like get your body to be a certain way when you can just like say, oh, it's going to do its thing. I just have to do my work and I eat well and then my body does its thing and I trust it to do that for the most part. So yeah, I think that's really helpful.
And I think this too speaks to the idea that if you're trying to control it too hard, I do think that can even backfire for whatever you might have in your head for any type of body comp goals. I don't think that forcing your body to be a certain way is actually a long-term sustainable strategy to achieving body comp goals. And I think maybe a point to close on is it's not invalid to have body comp goals. I don't think they should be your only goals, and I don't think that you should be your guiding goals. But like the reality is a lot of people do have that kind of in the back of your mind. But I think actually the best path to having a body that you feel confident in is focusing not on how it looks, is focusing on doing the work and feeling it well. And it will just sort of settle at a place that I think is sustainable. And I think if you're happy and you're well fueled, hopefully you might be less critical of your body just from those kind of more mental effects as well.
Yep, I totally agree. I think that's a great way to close it. So, with that, I think we've kind of worked our way through what we felt would be a pretty challenging topic, but hopefully some things resonated and we would love feedback on it too and see, yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on this, please write in for sure. But with that, maybe we should transition to our challenges of the week. Katie, do you want to take it off first?
Sure. Okay. So my challenge of the week is in your training log or training peaks, however you're keeping track of your workouts, identify one thing that you did really well in a workout that didn't go well. So I got this done despite really high life stress, or I maintained a positive mindset even though the workout kind of sucked, or I fueled really, really well and it didn't work from a GI perspective, but I had the intention to do that. I think when we have a bad workout, it's really common to focus on here's 87 things that were bad about it. But if you can just find one that's more of a positive spin, I'm sure there's something that's in there. Even just saying, hey, I got out the door, like I started this workout. It can give you a little bit of a boost and hopefully not make you so scared the next time you go into a workout. You don't want those workouts to really shake your confidence in a way that you're not going to come back.
I really love that. Yeah, I did that to myself yesterday when I had a tough workout, but got it done despite X. So I love that. Cool. Okay, mine's a little different this week, but it's in reflection to the two larger purchases I've made in my adult life of treadmill and the backyard sauna, and feeling just like so empowered by them for some reason because I just really love them. So I think the takeaway is maybe just identify one thing that you genuinely love to purchase for your life. It might be a bigger thing. It doesn't have to be like a very expensive thing, but something that you maybe have been waffling on for a while and unsure about. And then just like make a goal of getting it in some capacity, if it's saving for a couple months or however long it takes, or just going out and like making the sacrifice right now to get it. Mainly because I have been really pleasantly surprised by how it feels to commit to something by making an investment out of it and then really reaping the benefits of it. So yeah, I would challenge people to actually just go after one thing that feels really exciting to them from a purchase perspective.
I love that. And I think we need to give ourselves permission to get a big treat or a little treat. If it's going to help you to achieve your goals, like your sauna and your treadmill are right on the path to you achieving your goals in sports. So why
Yeah.
not? I love that.
It's an investment in yourself. So
Yes.
allow yourself to make investments in yourself. Yeah.
I love that. That is a good challenge of the week. Wow, real mic drop there. Okay, gear picks of the week. I've got a little bit of a bougie one, but I was talking in the beginning about figuring out my vitamin D was kind of low. I recently got a subscription to a company called Function Health, and basically they do really comprehensive blood work twice annually for a price that is high, but I think for what you are getting through Function Health, it's actually really good. So we've talked about before, you can go to, for example, Quest Diagnostics and buy a la carte tests, but sometimes it's like $200 for a single thing to get tested at Quest. Whereas through Function, you say, hey, I'm getting all these things tested and it is a relatively low price. And they also have doctors review the results and kind of send you a summary. They recommend supplements. And if there's anything that's really abnormal, they'll let you know, hey, you should take this to your primary care doctor, whoever, to get a follow-up or kind of understand what's going on. So I've done this recently. It's been really interesting. I find it empowering to kind of learn more about my own health, and also flag things that I hadn't even thought of, noticing like, oh, I am low in vitamin D and now I can maybe really improve how I'm feeling just by taking a supplement. That's really good to know. So I would recommend it. If anyone wants to reach out to me, I have a discount code, I believe, that I got. And Elena, you probably have one too, because I think anyone who's on Function has a discount something. But it's been good so far, and I recommend it to everyone.
I love it. Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan. I've been really interested in the kind of naturopathic preventative health care for a while, so I was pretty fast on this one last year when it came out. I'm curious to see how they evolve as a company. They are relatively new, and when I have gone to Quest Diagnostics in the past and I went for my Function Health visits, I was pretty surprised to hear from the phlebotomists there that they are getting so many Function Health people coming in. I think it speaks to this like lack of we've had in our healthcare system for a while of being able to have opportunities to better understand your health from a testing perspective. So I definitely think it's the future of healthcare to a certain extent. And yeah, definitely really useful in terms of getting some data back on you. So I did it last year and I found it really helpful. And I'm going to get my follow-up test probably in a couple months and curious to see how things have changed, if at all. So yeah. Okay, my gear pick of the week is so simple. But basically I have these thermal shirts from a company called Cuddle Duds, and I was gifted them, honestly, I want to say 10 years ago from a friend who shopped at Kohl's. I'm pretty sure they sell both online but also at like large department stores, and they're therefore not very expensive like Kohl's. And they have been like my go-to shirts for working out for 10 years. They're so flexy and comfy. They're really soft and they're light enough while still being warm. I wear them skiing. I wear them on winter runs. I've worn them on like pretty much all of my adventures. I brought them around the world with me when I backpacked around the world. I don't know why I haven't put it as a gear pick of the week before, mainly because it's like not a brand that people maybe recognize. But sometimes when you get something simple that's good, you just gotta stick with it. So those are my recommendations today.
That's fantastic. And it keeps you grounded to be like, okay, sometimes we're recommending the sauna, but sometimes it's Cuddle Duds, which I love.
Yeah, exactly. We have a range of recommendations on here.
We do. Amazing. I think the rule is every week someone goes bougie and someone goes budget. And so you have two choices if you're going to buy stuff from our recommendations.
Exactly. Function Health might be very different than Cuddle Duds, but you know, it's okay.
We're going for breadth here. Awesome. Okay, well, this was a lot of fun as always. Again, we could probably spend 2 or 3 more episodes just kind of drilling into more topics related to body image and fueling. So if that's of interest, listeners, let us know. Please also consider dropping us a rating or a review if you haven't yet. And if you want to give us feedback, we have a link. It's in our show notes. Please feel free to check it out. And thanks so much for listening.